Right, let's dive straight into this explainer and talk about why dropping a completely brutal killer into a Spider-Man story is honestly an absolutely genius storytelling move for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. If you've been keeping up with the buzz around the upcoming Spider-Man Brand New Day, you probably already know that Jon Bernthal's Punisher is crossing over to interact with Tom Holland's web-slinger. And yeah, on the surface, this might just look like some classic, cool MCU crossover stuffing. You know, a fun excuse to get two massive New York icons in the same shot. But when we actually dig into the source material and look at the emotional trajectories of these two guys, it becomes clear that it's way, way deeper than just fan service.
So, after losing literally everyone, what actually stops Spider-Man from just crossing the line? Honestly, that question right there is the emotional hook for our whole analysis today. It throws us straight into this intense psychological tension between a completely lonely Peter Parker and Frank Castle. Because, let's be real, top-tier superhero writing doesn't just mash characters together because they look awesome on a poster. It pairs them up because one character makes the other's choices vastly more difficult. And Frank Castle, he is uniquely, perfectly designed to challenge Peter Parker at the exact moment when Peter is at his most vulnerable.
We really have to remember where Peter is at right now. Following the incredibly tragic events of Spider-Man No Way Home, Peter is in the most isolated, lonely place he has ever been in his entire life. I mean, Doctor Strange's reversal spell worked, but the cost was absolute. Peter lost almost every single person who anchored the Spider-Man persona back to the humanity of just being Peter Parker.
So, think about his current status. His public identity was totally erased by magic. The people who made wearing the mask bearable, MJ, Ned, Happy, they have zero memory of the kid underneath it. He's operating out of this tiny, freezing apartment, probably struggling just to make rent, listening to police scanners all night. No Avengers safety net, no Aunt May, no best friends. Spider-Man isn't just a part of Peter Parker's life anymore. Spider-Man might actually be the only life he has left. And when the mission becomes your entire existence, well, you're walking a very, very dangerous line.
Now, to really grasp why Frank Castle matters so much in this specific context, we need to trace his bloody 10-year history in the MCU. Because Frank didn't just pop out of thin air for this movie. We have this deeply established, visceral understanding of exactly who this man is and what he represents in this universe.
Thinking back over his decade-long journey, we've witnessed Frank's dark evolution from a grief-stricken serial killer to a reluctant, street-level protector. I mean, we first met him back in 2016 in Daredevil Season 2, right? Where he was basically a force of nature, wiping out the gangs responsible for his family's murder. Then we followed him through 2 seasons of his own show, hunting down the deeper conspiracies of his military past. And, more recently, we saw his return in Daredevil Born Again and his own special presentation, One Last Kill. He has spent a solid decade waging a brutal, one-man war on crime.
Which brings us to a really pivotal moment. There's this hallucinated quote from the special presentation One Last Kill that cuts straight to Frank's deepest wound. It shows us that his violence gave him motion, sure, but it never gave him peace. In that special, Frank has essentially finished the mission he thought would finally end his pain. The kill wall came down, but he found absolutely nothing at the finish line. He actually hallucinates his old friend Karen Page, accusing him of choosing this endless war. It perfectly reveals that the Punisher identity is what keeps him moving forward, but it's also the exact thing that keeps him utterly alone.
And that brings us to the core conflict of this explainer. What actually happens when the kid who saves everyone meets the man who executes them? In Brand New Day, we're looking at the cleanest, sharpest possible moral contrast for Peter Parker. I mean, they operate in the exact same city, they fight the exact same kind of criminals, and they both understand a really harsh, fundamental truth. Violence changes people. But their responses to that violence, they could not be further apart.
When we compare their codes side by side, the contrast is just staggering. Peter turns grief into rescue. Frank turns grief into permanent punishment. Think about it. Spider-Man's entire heroic identity revolves around restraint. He firmly believes people can still be saved. His code simply does not allow him to treat suspicion, anger, or even his own immense personal guilt as permission to execute somebody. But the Punisher's identity? That depends on absolute certainty. Frank believes some threats just need to be ended permanently, and that some people have already forfeited their right to a second chance.
Both are fundamentally wounded men operating in the very same city, but they made entirely opposite choices with their trauma. Peter lost Uncle Ben and Aunt May, and he decided his immense power had to be used to protect others. Frank lost his wife and children in Central Park and decided his pain gave him a permanent, never-ending war. So Peter looks at Frank and sees a man who crossed a line he absolutely refuses to cross. And Frank looks at Peter and just sees a good kid who refuses to accept how ugly the real world actually is.
Now here's a really cool piece of comic trivia for you.
This dynamic isn't just random MCU crossover stuffing. Actually, since 1974, the Punisher has been a Spider-Man problem. In his very first comic appearance, Amazing Spider-Man number 129, a villain named the Jackal actually manipulated Frank into believing Spider-Man was a murderer. So Frank hunted him with the absolute certainty of a man who thinks judgment has already been passed. From day one, Frank has been the perfect foil for Peter, because he basically represents Spider-Man's core ethos, responsibility, but completely, entirely stripped of mercy.
And that is exactly why Frank Castle is Peter Parker's worst warning at this incredibly fragile, lonely moment in his superhero career. Throughout the MCU, Peter's journey has been heavily shaped by older mentors, right? Tony Stark gave him access to the massive Avengers machine. Nick Fury pulled him into international espionage. Doctor Strange opened the door to the multiverse. But Peter doesn't need another powerful adult explaining the rules to him anymore.
Frank stands at the end of a very, very dark road, forcing us to ask what happens when the mission completely swallows the man. Frank isn't there to give Peter cool new gadgets or offer him a spot on a team. No, Frank is there to show Peter a dead end. Because if you look closely at Frank Castle right now, there is almost no Frank Castle left. There's just the skull, the mission, the target, and the next body.
So Peter doesn't need another mentor giving him advice. He needs a terrifying living mirror showing him what happens if there is no Peter Parker left. The danger here isn't that Peter is going to suddenly grab some guns and become the Punisher overnight. The danger is much slower and, honestly, much sadder. The real danger is that Peter might start using Spider-Man as the only place where his pain feels useful, completely abandoning his life outside the mask. Frank is the physical embodiment of the cost of letting pain turn responsibility into punishment.
This terrifying ideological clash is also absolutely vital for the larger narrative leading into Avengers Doomsday. It brings the MCU right back down to gritty, street-level stakes. After battling Thanos in space and fighting literal multiverse villains on the Statue of Liberty, the universe desperately needs to remind us of the real, human cost of being a hero.
It's fascinating how the MCU's control problem escalates as you move up the ladder, going from street-level vigilantism straight up to cosmic domination. Think about how these different entities approach danger. Spider-Man sees danger and tries to save the person caught up in it. The Punisher sees danger and permanently eliminates it. The Department of Damage Control sees danger and treats it as an institutional containment problem. And eventually, Dr. Doom is going to look at the multiverse and argue that only absolute dictatorial control can save a broken world. These ideas aren't identical, obviously, but they definitely rhyme. Having Frank around makes Peter's right answer so much harder to defend, which keeps the story totally grounded in real bodies and real consequences rather than just abstract multiverse chaos. A strict no-kill rule sounds great, really simple, when you're fighting colorful villains and throwing out fun banter. It becomes infinitely harder when the guy standing next to you, a guy like Frank Castle, can literally point to dead bodies, repeat offenders, broken justice systems, and innocent victims who paid the ultimate price just for someone else's mercy. Peter's ultimate test is insisting that power does not erase personhood. A criminal is still a person, a broken man is still a person.
And finally, this leaves us with the ultimate provocative thought to ponder today. When a hero loses everything, does their humanity have to die with it? Frank Castle made his choice a long time ago. Now, it's Peter's turn. Will he use the mask to continue Uncle Ben's legacy of saving people, or is he going to use it to completely hide from the pain of just being Peter Parker? One thing is for sure, the Punisher's presence guarantees that whatever choice Spider-Man makes, it is not going to be easy. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and we'll see you next time.